Thank you, Stefan, for inviting me. I hope everyone can hear me okay. It's early morning my time in the central state of Tennessee, and I'm really thrilled to be here. And the theme for today is leadership responsibility. And I thought a little bit about what I wanted to share. And one of the streams of my work over the past few years has been really to think about individual improvement and the role of feedback and coaching in that area of work. I know often in these forums, we talk about systems improvement, we talk about school improvement, we talk about school effectiveness, but of course, schools and communities are really made up of individuals, and behind each number and behind each system are those individuals. And so when I think about the individual, I think a lot about how do we each, in my own role as a faculty member, in my role as I've had many academic leadership positions, deaning and chairing of departments. What's that role of feedback? And a funny story, when I teach my seminar, I provide a lot of feedback to my students on their written work. And I often think about it that, oh my goodness, they may feel that I'm being really harsh because I write all over their papers and I edit it and I make them write and rewrite and submit, and it's formative. They're not getting graded until the end. And then I say to my students that my feedback to you is a gift. It's a gift of mine that I care so much about your learning that I'm going to spend my time providing you this deep, ongoing, at times critical feedback, which made me think about why I'm feeling so badly about giving the feedback and what's my responsibility to give feedback, and why is it so hard for students or anyone in the work setting, leaders in our case, to receive feedback. And at least in the United States, we have formal requirements in many state law where principals, I'll use the word principals, I know in many settings it's school heads and school leaders, but I'm going to talk about principals, which are the school heads in public schools, are required to be evaluated by their supervisors on a rubric, and then the supervisor gives oral and then written feedback. So in the short time that I have today, I'm going to talk about feedback as a leadership responsibility and some of only one little slice of a project that's emerging that I'm working on with one of my PhD students. Now, why feedback? So I claim that we know a lot in the field about effective school leadership, but it's less clear about how to develop effective principal leadership. And the issues that we focus most on as professional learning communities, but the challenge there is that that's for a group, and I'm not in any way diminishing the importance of learning communities and learning together, but there is individual performance and individual roles, and I think feedback brings us back to the person and the one-on-one. How do we help individual leaders improve? So that's where I'm going to focus today. We know from both practice and our own experiences, as well as research, that principals do not receive very much feedback on their performance. I think that's something for us to question why that is. Again, it's so uncomfortable to be giving feedback. We feel guilty. We want to code it and make it maybe be positive. And then what happens if we're actually not telling the person anything helpful? And so giving feedback is hard and receiving feedback is hard as well. But feedback has benefits, and this is really documented in the broader literature on organizational behavior. It's very well documented about performance feedback and performance management. A lot has been written on 360-degree feedback. I'm going to draw on some of that work, some of it in education, but some of it not. But if this is an area of interest, we have a large literature outside of education. So feedback has benefits. The literature shows the extent to which it's reliable and valid can enhance performance. There's opportunity to influence how feedback can be managed to enhance self-awareness and provide strong motivation if it's done well. And feedback can improve continuous learning at the individual and then as a culture at the organizational level. So as a leader, and we have shown this in some of our research, if the leader is receiving feedback and willing to receive feedback and shares that as a norm in the organization, then teachers and others in the system can do so as well. So briefly, I'm going to talk about some of the theories behind performance feedback. I'm going to share one of our research studies that's underway, which is new, a study of tone and effective language in written feedback. And then I hope we do have some time for discussion. So I hope I've convinced you that feedback is important. Again, my claim is it can be used in conjunction with other learning supports and ongoing professional growth and development, but it cannot, it should not be avoided because it's hard, and that it's a leadership responsibility. It's a gift of ourselves as supervisors, as coworkers. I think we can reframe feedback as something that shows that we care about the individual's growth and development. So why is feedback so hard? So there's a lot of theory about this, and I'm going to present two scenarios that explains why it is so hard. So the first is a little story about a leader named Karen. And I think this is pretty typical. So imagine you're a principal supervisor. In the US, we have principal supervisors that do walkthrough in buildings. They observe teachers' meetings. They may look at the school data. They are part of the ongoing support and development, and then they provide feedback to individual principals. And so in this case, Karen's supervisor was sharing with her some of the gaps that the supervisor noticed in the school after multiple school visits. And then Karen, who's a relatively novice principal, starts to become quite defensive. And she says, you know, I don't understand. I've been in this school for 4 years. I'm doing all those things. I don't think what you're seeing is representative of what's happening. You should go talk to some of the other people. And you know how the conversation goes. There's a lot of defensiveness that it's, and a little bit of attacking the supervisor as if the supervisor doesn't really know what's going on in the school. And so we see this gap happening all the time in social situations, in social psychology. And we call this is highly a well-known theory in the literature, which is called the Dunning-Kruger effect. This is based on a very famous article that is called Unskilled and Unaware of It, How Difficulty in Recognizing One's Own Incompetence Leads to Inflated Self-Assessment. I love that title, Unskilled and Unaware. So basically and there's been a ton of research using this theory. And if you Google it, Dunning-Kruger, you'll find it very widespread in the literature in lots of different settings and in lots of different studies. But basically it's saying unskilled and unaware, that the extent to which a person is unskilled in an area, we misperceive our skill or our expertise, and then we become unaware of really where my skills or my knowledge or my dispositions for leadership in our case are. And then there's a gap between my own self-perception and how well I actually am performing. And this is an inverse relationship where for the expert, they tend to underestimate their expertise, their self-deprivation, and they tend to think that they don't know as much as they do, and everyone around them also does not know. And here we see this diagram that basically, again, shows the Dunning-Kruger effect, states that people with minimal amount of training and experience think they're much better than they actually are. So this Dunning-Kruger effect is a theoretical reason why it's so hard to receive feedback. Because if my self-assessment or my self-awareness is really often better than it is, when someone is telling me I have room for improvement, even if it's data-based, we become hurt and defensive. And when we become defensive, we shut down and we can't hear. So again, the Dunning-Kruger effect provides a little bit of a theoretical explanation how when we have limited knowledge and less skilled, such as a new leader, or maybe not a very effective leader, we often believe those leaders believe that they are more competent compared to others, and they lack the ability to recognize, to need, and grow. And so they become very self-defensive when beginning feedback. And if you have a highly skilled leader, often they assume that they are not as competent as they are, and then they also, it's hard for them to interpret feedback. So the Dunning-Kruger effect gives us some theoretical conceptual framing of why it's so hard to receive feedback. Now, in the area of principal feedback, this is from our own work where we studied principals receiving feedback. And we have a theoretical theory of action of how and why feedback is so difficult. So I'm just going to talk about this really, really quickly because I want to get into my study on the feedback. But here we see another kind of theory of action that when a principal or a leader receive feedback that meets or exceeds the principal's expectations, they are often positive and receptive because it aligns with their self-awareness, and they may be neutral or curious, and then they are interested in the feedback and are willing to engage to improve. Whereas, like the Dunning-Kruger effect, if the feedback is below the expectations of their own self-assessment of where they think they are, where their levels of competency are, often we have this cognitive dissonance between what someone is telling me, what the data are telling me, and what I myself think about myself. Then I, as a leader, become negative and defensive. And that's where we see the lack of take-up of feedback, where the behavior is, rather than thinking, how can I interpret and use this? But we have avoidance, denial, blaming the messenger, and other maybe political type of behaviors that have nothing to do with improvement and using the feedback. So together, these two framings explain, I hope you see, why receiving feedback is both so difficult, but also why it's part of a supervisor or a leader responsibility to try to engage in providing feedback that can be useful. Okay, so I'm not going to stop here, but here you see the references for the rationale of why feedback is so difficult when we have this gap between what others are saying about me and how I feel about myself. Now, up until now, I've only talked about the receiver of the feedback, the principal. And I also want to note, in conceptualizing the importance of feedback, we also have the characteristics or the framing from the supervisor point of view. And I'm not going to spend time on this in my study today very much, but it is important to also know that there's three kind of theoretical conceptual framings that really are important to consider about the person providing the feedback and collecting the data, in our case, the supervisor. So one is this notion of stereotype fit. We have implicit and explicit bias about the individuals that we are evaluating, or the individuals we're collecting data about. And individuals with certain demographic characteristics get systematically lower or higher evaluation scores. For example, gender and race, ethnicity, whether they're same race or different race, same gender, different race, evaluator and evaluatee. Another is confirmation bias, the evaluator's prior experiences, feelings, and beliefs that guide their implementation of collecting data and performance data. And this also has bias built into it. The research, sorry, is very clear about that. And then also there's organizational norms. Like in my organization, is it expected that everyone gets really positive feedback? And therefore it's really hard if I want to give constructive growth feedback. So there's also things working against, or, that are really difficult when you think about the supervisor side or the evaluatee side. Okay, so we also know a lot of things in the literature. So we know about what is the nature of the feedback that is most important. So we have the characteristics of the person receiving the feedback, the principal, and those gaps of self-assessment and awareness. We have some concerns or cautionary notes about the supervisor and the bias inherent in that. And those two people are coming together, right? And then the supervisor is giving the feedback. And there's a lot of literature on the qualities of high quality feedback. And they include the feedback should be specific. That means it aligns to the recipient's job responsibilities. It should be actionable. You should help the person and tell them what are some immediate suggestions for improvement. It should be based in evidence and data. So it's not that I feel that you're not engaging parents, but it's that we went in your parent meeting, I noticed that. So it's data driven, both observational and it could be surveys, all the data, achievement data. And then lastly is this notion of tone. And I'm going to spend the last few minutes talking about tone. And so tone is effective language, and it refers to the way in which feedback is communicated, positive, negative, or neutral. And so we don't know that much about tone because it's hard to study. In other words, you either have to observe feedback being given and code it, or you have to analyze written feedback. And that's what we've just done in one of my studies. So I'm going to talk really quickly about that. So what is the effective language of principals evaluation feedback? Tone, positive emotion, and negative emotion are the ways in which we analyze the written feedback. Tone refers to the extent to which the evaluative overtone of feedback is positive or negative. And effective language can be expressed versus adjectives, such as excellent versus disappointing. So clearly, if you say something's excellent, that's a positive tone. If it's disappointing, that's a negative emotion tone. So we know from the literature what affective language is, that language that is overly negative, critical, or controlling will be discouraging and people cannot act upon it. We know that affirmative feedback and praise is helpful, but on the other hand, if you overly provide positive feedback, then you're downplaying poor or negative areas of improvement. A person may not be able to hear and know that there's actually something to improve here. And I just want to say that's the crux of my argument about a leadership responsibility. It is hard to provide a tone of feedback that can be both clear and useful and not hurtful. But at the same time, I claim that as leaders, we shy away from that, and ultimately we hurt the people that we're trying to help because they do not understand that we're actually trying to help them improve. Okay, so I'm going to run through this quickly here. So we did a study of written feedback in one state in the United States, where principals were supposed to be observed across the whole state twice a year. And then there's a rubric, which you can see on the slide. And supervisors rated principals on the rubric on a scale from 1 to 5. But what was interesting from the affective language feedback point of view is that supervisors had to choose 2 indicators and write the feedback that principals would get in a written report, as well as in a pre and post observation meeting. So one feedback indicator that the supervisor had to write was called a refinement indicator. And a refinement indicator is the area that needs improvement, whereas the reinforcement indicator is so we could say the refinement indicator is the more negative area of improvement, and the reinforcement indicator is the positive. Here's what you're doing well, you should reinforce it and continue to do it. So we wanted to know what's the affective language and the tone of giving feedback. And is the tone so overly positive that no one knows really what to do? Is it actionable? Is it specific? And is it high quality? Just so you can see in general, the feedback was approximately on average 35 words. We could talk a lot about this, how many supervisors is a principal observing and working with, but there was quite a large range from one word, like great job, to really long 500 words, but the average was around 35 words. Okay, here's an example. So in the domain of environment in the culture of teaching and learning domain, here you can see, and I'm not going to read it to you, but here you can see an example of refinement and reinforcement. So in this case, what you might notice is that the principal is saying really pretty much how things are going quite well. That it's quite, positive, that it's quite positive, and things that the principal can do to improve. Now, when we analyze using, this is machine learning because we had over 8,000 entries, you can see here the difference between positive affective language and negative affective language. So in the positive, we see significant strength, continue to support, all these accolades, all the things that they're doing well. In the negative affective language, we see this continues to be a focal problem. So this notion of continues suggests that the principal has failed to make improvement in this area, implying the need for improvement is due to a lack of willingness on the part of the principal. So if we did a workshop and we took the negative affective language and we tried to reframe it, still an area of improvement, to be positive affective language, it would be interesting to know if the leader could be in a better emotional state to receive the feedback and not have this misaligned and unaware reaction. Just a question, we don't know. And then in other feedback, we saw there's no difference. So it's confusing to the principal. Continue to develop procedures to ensure that all teachers are accountable for student improvement. And then similarly, continue to leverage resources through community partners. Well, they're both saying me the same thing, so I don't know what I should be working on. So that's not very helpful. Very quickly, we found some differences in gender. So remember, we talked about bias. Female principals receive feedback that is slightly more positive in tone. Female principals tend to receive feedback with a smaller percentage of positive words. And there may be suggested evidence also about differences between male and female evaluators. So something else to continue. So in conclusion, I know I've gone over my time a little bit. I hope that I have piqued your interest in the notion of feedback as a leadership responsibility, that it's conceptually rooted in social psychological literature about why it's so difficult. The management literature highly digs into this topic about how to develop feedback. And this notion of affective language and tone, I think, is something that could be developed to better help us really implement that gift of feedback, to show that we are committed to the growth of our leaders as individuals, not only as system leaders. Thank you.